As President of the Royal Society of New South Wales, I'm delighted to welcome you to the 2022 Royal Society of New South Wales and Learned Academies Forum. The Society convenes or has convened this forum every year for several years, and it's always a highlight of the calendar. The Academies with which we partner are focused on health and medical sciences, humanities, science, social sciences, and technology and engineering. And it epitomises the society itself, which has been a nexus of ideas and discovery for 200 years, always challenging the population to think differently, always reporting on the latest research and facilitating solutions to some of the major challenges confronting humanity. Celebrating, as we have this year, a 200-year milestone of our existence pales into insignificance compared to the long history of Aboriginal, Australian and Torres Strait Islander peoples. In paying our respects to elders past, present and emerging of the Gadigal and the Indigenous nations across New South Wales, we recognise their deep knowledge, care and custodianship of land, seas and waterways. I'm delighted to invite Her Excellency, the Honourable Margaret Beazley, ACKC, Governor of New South Wales and Patron of the Royal Society of New South Wales and host of the forum today at Government House, to open proceedings. Her Excellency is an eminent Australian jurist, currently 39th Governor of New South Wales, and immediately before this appointment, she was President of the New South Wales Court of Appeal, the first woman to hold that office. Her Excellency was made a Companion of the Order of Australia in the Australia Day Honours List in January 2020 for her eminent service to the people of New South Wales, particularly through leadership roles in the judiciary and as a mentor for young women lawyers. Your Excellency.
Thank you, Dr. Pond. As always, and in the language of the Gadigal, in whose acknowledgement I join in, Bujari Gamarua, Dian Babana Gamarara, we are on Gadigal Nagara. In accepting this always very kind invitation to commence the forum and introduce the forum, could I give Dennis's apologies? If there is anyone in the room who is studying the social impacts of man flu, which I've diagnosed as a sniffle, there is a willing, I'm not sure that there's a willing candidate, but he does send, he picked up a head cold when we were in Newcastle, up on the bluff, watching the retreat, and on Sunday night, and he's picked up a head cold, and I think it's better, and he thinks it's better that he not sort of associate with members with you and other members of the public. We have become, I think, and most properly more concerned about interactions, you know, when we have colds and flus, and I think that is a very good thing. If we've learned one thing from the pandemic, it is, I think, that more general concern with not only our own health, but I think with our fellow man, as it were, and looking after and extending that. It's almost a courtesy, actually, to them. In looking at this year's forum, Reshaping Australia, Communities in Action, to me that immediately raised questions as why are we talking about reshaping Australia? Why are we talking about communities in action? And certainly research in Western countries, at least, over the last decade or so, indicates a diminishing trust in institutions, and sometimes seriously so. The causes for this are manifold, complex, and more often than not, interrelated. And whilst survey results provide a sound enough working guide deeper analysis is required. Hence, your forum, the 22 forum topic, Reshaping Australia, Communities in Action, is timely and will undoubtedly be thought-provoking. Having cautioned about the limitations of survey results, as we must, I've nonetheless found it instructive as an introduction to your forum to have brief regard to the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute's figures for the years from 2018 to 2021. I've used this source as it has wide credibility and is a reference point for many institutions, including government. So in response to the question that was posed by the Institute, what do you think is the most important problem facing Australia today? It will come as no surprise that in 2020 and 2021, the response far and above any other issue was COVID-19. During those 2 years, Australians were faced with an existential health crisis that left many feeling uncertain, fearful and isolated. And they were the social impacts as opposed to the medical impacts. And it was a time when, due to governmental regulation of association and movement, rights that we always consider to be very basic, communities as such were missing in action because communities and community organisations were, like individuals within community, locked down. In the years immediately prior to the pandemic, the section Economy, Unemployment, Poverty were identified in the Scanlon Foundation research surveys as the most important problem facing Australia. So that was in the 2 or 3 years prior to the pandemic. For the 18th-month period from January 2020 to July 2021, the economy and those related features of employment and poverty had tracked second as the most important issue. In July 2021, the environment came up and began to track on the same level of importance as the economy. The category quality of government/politicians in the Scanlon survey always scores well, in the sense that it sits third, equally with social issues, as the most important problem facing Australia. And that has been consistent during that 5-year period from 2018. During that same period, immigration and population has not rated of significant concern in the survey results. There is one other statistic that I will mention, namely the extent to which there is trust in government. The specific survey question is this: the extent to which the government in Canberra can be trusted to do the right thing for the Australian people. Interestingly, in the years since 2007, the results for 2020 and 2021 were the highest of the whole period, that there was trust in the federal government. Having said that, in that period of time from 2007, trust never rose above 50%. Like the other statistics to which I have referred, these figures are indicative of issues affecting people, mostly on a daily basis. It's their reactions to and the effect of governmental decision-making, and more broadly indicate a current mood in the community. This raises the question of the extent to which perception and reality are running along parallel paths, maybe the same path, but at least parallel paths, or are diverging. It also raises the question of where government and communities sit in relation to each other, and what that means in terms of how we are in fact governed and how we might be best governed. Increasingly, government policy is to outsource significant areas of care, allowing communities to identify the areas of most need. Government then becomes a source of funding for those areas of need, although, as we know, there are always funding constraints. The funding applications themselves are quite competitive, and again, the community becomes a necessary and vital funding resource. Another emerging trend is the extent to which specific communities take control of issues that affect them directly or affect society more widely. I've encountered recent examples of the former coming out of the flood disasters, especially in the Northern Rivers. As the representative of one Indigenous organisation said, as she worked long hours in a recovery centre that the organisation had set up, and I quote, "We know who our people are, where they are, and how they are. We can and need to look after ourselves." And she used the words, "It was all about self-determination." I found that very interesting. When we hear the words self-determination used, sometimes we think of something quite different. But this was a specific community responding to a specific need, but with a longer-term vision. Her vision, it was immediate, but it wasn't only short-term. It was reactive, but not merely reactive to the immediate needs of the community. She was looking at a strategic picture, and as I've said, there was a strategic picture in the frame. There were similar stories in the little towns scattered across that Northern Rivers regions, amongst different communities with different constituencies and differing needs. In many ways, those responses to the disaster captured the core meaning of community, which, as we know, derives from the Latin word communitas, or public spirit. However, and as I suspect you are thinking, no group in community lives in isolation. So how do these smaller pockets of community fit into the bigger societal questions of education, health, transport, employment, housing, much of which of necessity involves government? The other trend of specific groups and communities driving larger societal agendas is particularly apparent in the corporate field, with a focus on the ESG principles, environment, sustainability and governance. Much of this has been a response to shareholder and consumer pressure, as well as to legal advice. But its impact is unquestioned, both on communities and on government. My remarks thus far have been essentially observational. Whether we are talking about how community organises itself, how government works, or how both work together, needs good data. What we saw and heard in Lismore was a community responding to a crisis in a community already in great need, obvious from the already existing data. According to the New South Wales Council of Social Services, in 2019, 21% of Lismore residents were living in poverty. And the Northern Rivers communities in general have higher rates of poverty than both the state and the national average. Moving away from Lismore and community responses to disasters, the 2022 Poverty in Australia Snapshot report found that 3.3 million people in Australia live below the poverty line. In percentage terms, 13.4% of the population, or 1 in 8, and 16.6% of children, 1 in 6, live below the poverty line. Communities and community needs are not only about poverty, although that we have any poverty, let alone the extent revealed in the figures I have just mentioned, is sobering. But community is about the greater good for everyone. Improvements, collaboration, research, met needs in any one sector should, and I would suggest must, trickle both down and up, including to government. The words of a postdoctoral student came to mind when these thoughts were going through my mind. Social change requires that we rewrite our communal narratives. This year's forum raises some challenging issues which affect us all. Congratulations again, I do have to say, to the Royal Society for taking on the challenge and for the contributors today who are instrumental in analysing the problems and directing us towards a solution for the betterment of all. Thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your insightful remarks, which clearly reflect the experience you are gaining across the community as Governor of New South Wales. It's very good to have the personal reflections of what you're seeing across the state. I need to present some thanks at the beginning of the day and not having the opportunity later. So I'd like to thank the Office of the Chief Scientist and Engineer and each of the 5 learned academies for their sponsorship and support again for this forum. Without them, we could not hold this important conversation about reshaping Australia, communities in action. Welcome to the 100 of you in the in-person audience today. In addition to our speakers, our in-person audience is made up by representatives of the Society, each of the 5 academies, the Office of the New South Wales Chief Scientist and Engineer, and we're also joined by 16 undergraduate students who should be easy to identify from 7 universities, extending as far as Wollongong and Newcastle, and some members of the public. So welcome one and all. Welcome also to the online audience, which is watching the forum across Australia via our live streaming, and also to those who watch it later on our YouTube channel. Days like this are not conjured up by magic. They do require the sustained and dedicated input by a band of volunteers. So I take this opportunity to thank the members of our program committee, so ably chaired by Professor Stephen Garton, our moderator, Julianne Schultz, and members of the planning committee, our webmaster, Emeritus Professor Lindsay Botton, and Robert Marks, the editor of the Journal and Proceedings. We will have several mechanisms to make the proceedings of today available to you in person, live stream, on the YouTube channel, and later in the written word, which may be what survives longest and will be available for people to read in 100 years' time. Stephen Garton, AM, is a Fellow of the Royal Society of New South Wales, the Australian Academy of Humanities and the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. He is Professor of History and former Provost and Senior Deputy Vice-Chancellor at the University of Sydney. He has written extensively on many subjects, including the history of mental illness, social policy on a range of issues, and interestingly, the history of Harlem in New York between World Wars I and II. Stephen will take the stage in a few minutes. The aim of today is to bring together learned societies, government and communities, all necessary, as Her Excellency has said, to work together to help tackle some of the urgent and relevant problems that we face nationally and internationally. By listening to communities, learned societies can find out what the communities need and appreciate the work they need to do at the front line and at the cutting edge to address the most pressing problems and the shared problems. Communities engaging with learned societies and government enables them to gain access to information that is otherwise somewhat hidden from them, in particular in the minds of the scholars, but on a more operational sense, behind paywalls on technical websites or written in language that needs to be deciphered. So we welcome the convergence of communities, government and learned societies today. To add to Her Excellencies and my own welcome, I now invite the Honourable Andrew Lee MP, a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, Assistant Minister for Competition, Charities and Treasury and Federal Member for FAHA in the ACT, to say a few words via video.
G'day, my name's Andrew Lee, the Assistant Minister for Competition, Charities and Treasury. I'm speaking to you today from the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people, so let me begin by acknowledging elders past and present. Dara Nuna, Dara Ngunnawal, Yungu, Nanamanyan, Dunimanyan, Nanawalwari, Darawari, Dindi, Wangaralin Jinyen. The theme of your discussion today, Reshaping Australia, Communities in Action, is a topic that is close to my heart. This is an issue which is fundamental to the trajectory of our nation. Over recent years, Australia has become increasingly disconnected. We've seen a fall in the number of volunteers and a decline in the share of Australians playing a team sport. We've seen a drop in the number of Australians who have joined a local community group or a social club or a political organisation. The number of churchgoers and attendees of other religious services has declined. The union membership rate is down. Compared to the mid-1980s, Australians know half as many of their neighbours and have half as many friends. But we can work together to turn that around. And what I love about your discussion, just opened by the distinguished Margaret Beazley, and including my friend Richard Holden, is that it will focus on some of the big questions as to how we fix our democracy. This has got to do not only with institutional changes, but policy reforms too. Making sure that every school is a great school, that there are opportunities for people to engage through a workplace that allows work-life balance, that we ensure that we have an Australia that is providing prosperity for all, and so people aren't so time-crunched and money-poor that they can't engage with their communities. The attempt to get there will involve pushing on many different levers, but the end goal is an exciting one. A reconnected Australia will be a healthier place because people with more friends tend to have better physical and mental health. It will be a happier place because we know that well-being and spending time with friends and family are so closely intertwined. And it will be a more economically productive place because we know that markets work best in high-trust environments. I wish I could be with you today for these important conversations. Yours are topics that have been roiling around in my head since I worked as a research assistant for Robert Putnam in the year 2000. They are topics that are fundamental to the future of our nation, and I thank you for convening this important discussion today.
So thank you. As Susan mentioned, I was the chair of the program committee, and I have a few people to thank. But before I do that, I want to also acknowledge that we're on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present, and also acknowledge that research and teaching has been going on these lands for tens of thousands of years, and we are just part of a very long and glorious tradition. Now, I want to say a few thanks. Susan, the President, is a bundle of energy and forcefulness and will not be stopped by anything. And her energy and enthusiasm to make sure that the program committee delivered on its brief. And she was there every inch of the way. So, Susan, you've been wonderful. And the representatives of the learned academies who were on the program committee were a fantastic group of people to work with. Pip Patterson, Harla Zekrat, Bridget Griffin-Foley, Tony Cunningham, Annabelle Duncan, all wonderful people to work with. Just one kind of sad note for the program committee that Robin King, who was an integral member of our committee and a great contributor just as we were in the final stages, died in a tragic family holiday accident. I also want to acknowledge Lisa Jackson-Pulver, who at the very last minute last night agreed to substitute for Marcia Langton, who unfortunately was too ill to come down. So Lisa's stepping into the breach at very short notice. One of the things that we did as we sat around as a group very early on was trying to think up what the theme would be. Somebody said there's this really interesting book, The Idea of Australia, written by Julianne Schultz. And we all went away and read it and we said, yes, this is she can't sell the book, I can. And it was one of the things that really got us thinking, and we were very pleased when we were able to secure Julianne to be the moderator for the day. I mean, her book is a very thoughtful, beautifully written, I may say, reflection on issues in our public culture, historical, sociological, cultural in its analysis, thinking through, as we as a committee were thinking through, some of the issues about our broader public culture and the evidence of growing disparity of outcomes, growing disparities in access and equity, and thinking through a political culture that we want, I think, to focus on cohesion, not disparity. And if you look at certain elements of our public culture, particularly certain elements of the media and particularly social media, it's a culture that looks more interested in declaring and defaming, not listening and collaborating. And I think that's one lens onto the broader culture. But actually, if you take another lens into the broader culture and we look at what's happening at local levels, we can see extraordinary innovation and extraordinary contribution. The minister's a little worried about the decline in volunteerism, and I think that's a genuine issue that hopefully will come out in some of the themes. But if you look at what's happening in the community sector, we have over 50,000 not-for-profits. We have over 1 million Australians working in the not-for-profit sector. We have 5 million Australians who are volunteers. And that's an extraordinary resource that's doing so much for our community. Some of it's about plugging gaps in broader policy. Some of it's about addressing the specificities of local issues and local aspirations. And I think through that lens, we can sometimes conceptualise that work as, oh, well, that's governments outsourcing cheaply to that sector. But it's also an extraordinary opportunity for us to think through the innovation that happens at the local level. And we know that in the past, some academics have claimed to speak for communities. But we're moving into a culture now where we need to listen to communities. We need to listen to the voice of Indigenous Australians. We need to listen to the voices of what's happening at that local level. And one of the things we wanted to do in today's forum is explore some great case studies, sometimes where academics are working with local communities, helping drive innovation, learning from those communities for their own research, but also contributing back to those communities, but also communities themselves coming up with very innovative solutions to endemic social problems at the local level. So there are green shoots in the community. And one of the things we want to do is look at some of those green shoots and create an environment where we can think through the issues of how we harness those green shoots, support that so that we can build greater community cohesion, greater equity in our society, and build a political culture of community and togetherness and listening rather than declaring. And I think there are many papers and contributors today that will give you some insights into some of the key areas that we think are important around climate, Indigenous access, health, education. We're not covering everything, but it is about bringing out some of those great green shoots from researchers working with communities and communities themselves coming forward. And I hope you enjoy the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. Goodbye. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Susan, and thanks to the Minister. I'm Julianne Schultz, and Stephen, thank you for talking about my book and explaining why I'm here, because that gives a sort of reason for why I'm going to be in this chair for the day, trying to facilitate this discussion. One of the things that I was very conscious of and was trying to grapple with really when I was writing that book was to try and figure out how change happens and why it happens. And I was trying to tease out the tendrils of cultural practice, history and institutional design that may enable us to adapt and respond, but also keep us trapped in ways of seeing and doing that make it difficult to move on. And indeed, that process of change, I think, is really one of the important things that we are grappling with, and we're starting to think about not only reshaping, but also the way in which communities are engaged in the sort of public life of the nation. One of the scholars that I read a little during that time was an Anglo-American historian called Linda Colley, who's a very great historian. And she it was written a lot about the British Empire and so on. And one of her observations, which she's written about, was that change generally takes 70 years and 10, that is a lifetime. And that occasionally you'll get things which hurry it up, you know, a war or a pandemic or some other major crisis. But that's the exception. Generally change takes a long time to emerge and become consolidated in a society. So that, I think, is a really, you know, on one level, a sort of sobering insight because it seems to be an awfully long time. But the other part of it is that it suggests that change is an iterative process that's happening all the time. And I think there are two really strong examples of that which we have just experienced today. I mean, one is I'm always amazed and terribly impressed when the Governor speaks in this place in language. When you think that what the Government House represents in the history of Australia, to have a Governor who is able to speak so fluently and so genuinely in the language of the First Nations people of this land really says something enormously important, which I think we should hang on to as a source of the sort of change that is possible. The other is in our social relations, and I think this sort of ties back into the community focus that we're discussing today. The campaign to enable same-sex marriage was a long time coming, but when it happened overwhelmingly, and people picked up as though life was always the same. I mean, there's been some pushback at the margins in some religious communities, but, you know, all those bakers who thought they were going to go out of business for cooking cakes that had said she and she actually seem to be doing okay. So our capacity to absorb change in our most intimate relations seems to me a good sign that we can actually do it in other spheres as well. So it's a sort of pattern of slow adaptation and change. I think, though, one of the things that we have been very conscious of, I think, especially in the academies over the last 25 years or so, has been just the viciousness of the culture wars. I mean, I don't generally like to talk culture wars stuff because I think it gets pushed into a box. But we've seen the process by which experts in all sorts of areas have been marginalised and demonised, have been made to feel that they've got something that they can't really be trusted, that they shouldn't be contributing to a public discussion. It's been a very concerted activity, and it's weakened people. It's made people feel nervous about, you know, engaging in the public domain. I think one of the really important things that's come out of that is not only has it sent scholars back into their studies to do the sort of historical research and to do other research which has actually thrown up different ways of understanding the place and the world in which we are, but it's also contrary to what the Minister said, and I know his numbers are right, but I think that on the ground there's something else happening, it's certainly thrown back up a strong sense of people finding their own community of interest with which they engage. And that may not be in the traditional forms of joining a Lions Club or going to a church, but it's through other forms of social activity that is enabled by the digital environment. And what I think is really interesting is that community activity that is around, that is digitally enabled, is really a sort of counterbalance to this, to the narrowing that we've been having to live through. Institutions, I think now we're obviously at a flashpoint. People have talked about the challenge of climate change, globalisation and geopolitical uncertainty, and the economic and security impacts that that's having on us all. Institutions that we used once to trust to navigate our way through this have imploded, and partly through their own shortcomings, as we saw in the Royal Commissions into the churches, for instance, and so partly through just the changes that have happened as a result of technology and other sort of economic factors. So the media, which once acted as a sort of unifying platform, is no longer operates in the same way. Unions have obviously become a much less potent force than they once were, although they may be coming back. Political parties, numbers have fallen, membership of political parties have fallen dramatically. So at the one hand, the sort of big old institutions have crumbled, but on the other hand, we're becoming more connected through the sort of digital processes, and so there's a sort of interesting tension there. As the Governor and others have said, trust is waning in government. But it's a two-way thing, trust. I mean, people's trust in government has weakened. But what I'd like to see, and I guess this goes to what the Governor was talking about in terms of trickle up, I'd like to see more evidence of government trust in people, in trust in communities to actually be able to do the things that they set themselves the challenges to do and the solutions that they come up with. It's not just, in the old model, the mass media model of the, post-war years is, and big political parties, it's, very hierarchical. What we're now seeing is something which is tipping that upside down. And so the process of trust has to work both ways. And so getting governments to learn how to trust people, and public servants and academics and others to learn how to trust people, is actually a really big part of the challenge that we face in this reshaping. But, just finally, before I introduce the panel, the first panel, the political change of the last election, without being partisan about it, showed that more than half the population voted for what would loosely be described a progressive party of one form or another, whether it was the Labor Party, the Greens, the Teals, the other community independents. There's a whole range of people who were being voted for who had a different agenda than the one that has been around for a long time. And so I think that is a sign that the community and the public is looking for these ways of moving forward, that are in one of those phases of the 70 years and 10, where a whole bunch of the change that has been building may get to a point where it tips over and actually becomes manifest. So I'm interested to see how that plays out in looking at the case studies that we'll be hearing about today, and the examples and the great leadership that our speakers will be bringing to this discussion. Two final things. Robert Putnam, who the Minister talks about very, very enthusiastically, for whom he was a research assistant, wrote a very famous book called Bowling Alone, which was about the collapse of community in America. Last year, I think maybe it was the year before, he wrote a new book which was called The Upswing, which was about how things were starting to change and how things could change through moving from a society. And what he was doing was looking historically at the good and bad over the last century, or 125 years, and how 125 years ago in America was the Gilded Age. It was the age of individualism, it was the age of corporate excess. It was an age not unlike our own in many ways. And the process by which the society went from one which was about me to about we, to use that horrible jargon, is one that he found very instructive. And he sees in the green shoots in the United States of moving back to a we society through the activism that's happening on the ground in community areas. Now, we shall see. It's a much more complex world than it was even 120 years ago. So I'd like to hear the Minister's reflection in a way on where Putnam is getting to now, because he's much more optimistic about the possibilities of change. And I'd just say finally, anyone listening to the ABC News as you were coming here today would have heard the lead items were ones about community activism. They were about the big rallies that have been held in every capital city for the death of Cassius Turvey in WA whenever it was, a couple of weeks ago. big rallies all around the country, you know, saying this is just not acceptable in this country. The next story was about floods and the way that communities in Western and Central New South Wales were rallying to support each other as they faced yet another environmental catastrophe. So there are green shoots around. They might be under a lot of water, but there are green shoots around, and that's what we will be discussing today.